Good to see everybody out there this morning. Good to see a little rain too this morning. Kind of long overdue. We're in the book of Hebrews. We got into chapter 11, just a few verses in last week. So turn there with me, if you will, to Hebrews 11, and we'll pick up where we left off last Sunday, which was, I believe, we got through verse 3. So just let's reframe where we left off. This is now faith, verse 1, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Remember, we keep referring back to Romans 1, where he says, since creation, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Invisible attributes are clearly seen. And how they're seen is faith. In that first, we talked about it last week, acceptance, faith in those first 5 words in the Bible. In the beginning, God created. And if we can accept that and not reject it, we're able to receive the rest of the light. And then the evidence of his invisible attributes will be clearly seen for us. Talked about the fact that faith is that active ingredient. It gives substance to things hoped for, as we see here in this verse. Faith being the opposite of rejection, faith in God. And like we talked about, that first rejection of him as God sinks us back into the darkness, and we lose the ability to see what's clearly seen by those that have faith. So, talked about the fact that faith is that what activates, and it's what activates our knowledge. And in verse 2, we see, for by it, that is faith, the elders obtained a good testimony. In verse 3, by faith, we understand. By faith, we understand. We spent some time on this last week. This is the fact that matter did not create itself. We understand that the worlds were framed, and the things that are seen were made of things, were not made of things which are visible. And so matter was created by God and ordered by him. It says here, framed by his word. And so that is where we left off. Let's pick it up now. This is a great faith chapter in verse 4. This is really faith at the beginning of the dawn of history. Verse 4 says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he, being dead, still speaks. So that's his faith through it. Being dead still speaks. So Abel, this is 4,000 BC. So that'd be 6,022 years ago, for those of us keeping track. This is the second by faith of the by faith statements in this chapter. And this one goes back all the way to Genesis 4. So both Cain and Abel, you know the story, came forth to worship God as was prescribed. And it's really striking that these two, the children of the first parents, Adam and Eve, we already see the two camps forming. In camp 1, we see Abel, who came in the prescribed acknowledgement of God, and in this, what we, I guess we'd call it the first religious, practice that was enacted right after the Garden of Eden. And God had made clear what was required from the very beginning, that death was required to cover sins. And this had been continuing on. So with that, it carries with it a confession and a profession of faith in a Redeemer, a substitute, an innocent substitute. And then you have the other camp. So that's Abel, who brought the prescribed sacrifice to God in acknowledgement of him. And then you have the other camp, Cain. He brought the works of his hands, we see, the best of his crops. And he followed his feelings, didn't he? He felt that he really hadn't done anything so bad as to require the death of a substitute. And instead, he brought gifts, his best, works of his hands, attempting to earn God's favor by his works. So we have this first liberal, the modern equivalent of the liberal churches, prescribing works righteousness over the blood of the Lamb. And this rejecting of the blood. And we're going to see that their offerings, these religious that prescribe works righteousness, all of their offerings and all their works sit on the altar unaccepted by God. And it is the same thing that happened to Cain. But they sit useless on the altar, or they'll be burnt up, as we saw in the first service in 1 Corinthians, 3:13, I think it is. But useless and unaccepted on the altar. So we see that this Cain in the second camp was also the first murderer. He was the first one to build a city and build and inhabit a city. And we see that these are the centers of God-denying corruption and evil. And they always have been, these city centers, always have been that way since the beginning of time. And he was the first one to build and inhabit a city, first murderer, the first religious innovator to take what was prescribed to honor God and to improve upon it. And has many followers in all of his firsts, as a first murderer, first liberal, first religious innovator, and the first one to build the city. He has many followers in that. But there's also Abel in the other camp, and there's a stark difference here between the two approaches to God. One recognizes that he or she cannot approach God because of our sin, and there's no amount of good works that we can do to counteract that condition. It requires the blood of the Lamb. And the other, in their pride, we fail to admit our own condition, and we feel like we can counteract any obstruction or shortcoming by a succession of good works, things I can do just to be good enough. And you know what? Then maybe I can put God in my debt, and he'll owe me salvation. Well, that's just not going to work. He's not going to owe you forgiveness and acceptance. And it reminds me again of the Pharisee who leaned on his own righteousness. We saw this, referred to it earlier in this study. In Matthew 18, Jesus gave us a parable of these two. It says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. This is Matthew 18, 10 through 14. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now remember, tax collectors were considered the worst of sinners back then. So when you called somebody a tax collector, that's like calling them the worst corrupt person there is. But anyway, the Pharisee stood, this is the religious, stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, unlike the Pharisee standing right up front, so everybody could see him praying. No, the tax collector standing afar off would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says this in verse 14. He says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and everybody who humbles himself will be exalted. I think I'd rather humble myself and let God do the exalting than trying to exalt myself. It's much better plan. But great truth revealed in that, right from the mouth of Jesus. Proverbs 16:25 says this, there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Yeah, it seems right. We feel like we should have to do something, some material work. But works righteousness is rejecting Christ's sacrifice and the shed blood, his shed blood, and we're denying its all sufficiency, saying, well, we got to add, some works to that or else, But it's that self-pride. It's saying to God, I got this. Tara?
I don't want to get you off track, but it goes with what you're saying. You use the word pride. And I see a lot of that in the culture around us right now.
Yeah.
The word pride is not associated with anything positive in the Bible. It goes before destruction. And of course, there's a pride that's okay, but then there's a haughty pride. There's a
self-pride.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just making me think about it with the passage today and what you're talking about, because the use of pride is not supposed to be a great thing that we're waving around on banners. It's not.
Right.
It's not
Absolutely. Yeah. And in this case, this works righteousness angle is pride, and it's saying to God, I got this. I can be good enough, right? Instead of saying, I need you, God. I need you. That's the difference. Anyway, back to verse 4. Look at this. God testifying of his gifts. So we can assume that this refers to God coming and consuming the offering. We're in Hebrews 11:4, and where it says that Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. And then he says, God testifying of his gifts. Well, there was some way that they knew whether the gift was accepted or not, clearly. And so I'm just going to assume that it was God came and consumed the offering through fire or something like that. And that was a sign that the offering and the offerer was accepted by God. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. Leviticus 9:24 says this, and fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. And then 2 Chronicles 7:1, Solomon was dedicating the temple. And it says this, when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So there's other references in David, life of David, Elijah. Fire comes down from Yahweh God and consumes the offering. And that is how you know it was accepted. And so that's the same case here. It says here, God testifying of his gifts. So it's my opinion that Cain knew instantly that his offering was rejected by God. The fire did not come and consume his, and it sat useless and ineffective on the altar. And this is just like the sacrifices, the works of many packed churches out there. They're done in the view of others to please them, and they too sit useless on the altar, ineffective. God's always concerned, just like that parable we just read from Matthew 18. The man didn't have to say a word. God knew what he felt in his heart, and he knew what the other guy, the religious guy, thought in his heart also. That text, 1 Corinthians 3:13, that Brother Cam was in this morning, talked about each one's work will be tested with fire. And it's, anyway, and through it, So again, Abel's faith, back to verse 4. It said, and through it, he being dead still speaks. So because he had faith, he's dead and he still speaks. You see how uniquely powerful faith is? Abel still speaks to us today. 6,000 years later. And what does he say to us in this, what we know about the Cain and Abel story? He still speaks. One, we need to acknowledge God, and we do have a need to worship him and praise him. And our offerings and worship to God will be acceptable if they're offered in faith. And that our offerings and worship, by our offerings and worship, we shouldn't suppose to be earning salvation from God. Just a repentant heart that acknowledges its own unworthiness and instead relies on the sacrifice of the innocent, the substitute, Christ's perfect righteousness instead, if we rely on that. What else? If we're accepted by God, we can expect to be envied, despised, mistreated, and perhaps killed, as be a martyr, as Abel was, the first religious martyr, killed by his own brother. What else? Oh, we also see from that Cain and Abel story that God will not allow injuries to his accepted people go unpunished, and nor his people go unrewarded for their sufferings. It says he still speaks. And in Psalm 112:6, it says, the righteous will be held in everlasting remembrance. Well, 6,000 years later, we still remember Abel. And so that's that one. From the beginning of time, 6,000 years. And now let's fast forward. By faith, Enoch in verse 5. Enoch. Now he was born in 3382 BC. So if we add 2020 to that, that's about 5,400 years ago. So Enoch, 5,400 years ago, well, that's when he was born. So later than that, yeah, actually he lived 350 years, I think, somewhere around there. I got it in my notes here, 365, when God took him away. So this is more like 3000 BC. But anyway, he was taken away that he did not see death and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Well, we're going to see in a couple verses that it's impossible to please God without faith. This is in verse, I think it's 13 coming up. It says, without faith, or 6, verse 6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So here's how this verse reads in the Old King James. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. So Enoch was taken, body, soul, and spirit, into heaven, as God will do to any of us that are alive at his second coming. Now, some call that the rapture, but our Bibles have a better word for it. That word rapture doesn't appear in the Bible at all, but the word translated does in the Old King James. Rather than taken away, it says translated. So that's actually a better word. We could use that instead. By faith, Enoch was translated from this to that, translated. So Enoch was, like I mentioned, 365 years old when he was translated. This is in Genesis 5:23 is where we see this. He departed, was translated, not died, pretty young for those days. His son Methuselah lived to the ripe old age of 969. Emphasis on ripe. But 969. Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him, it says in Genesis 5:24. The Bible tells us that Enoch was seventh from Adam. So this seventh son on the way from Adam. And he was seemingly alone, we see in the Bible, in an apostate world. He walked with God, and he was so in tune with his spiritual side that he was able to control his carnal side, unlike most men. And most is an understatement. It's more than that. But he had a mastery over that, and had really focused on his spiritual side, and he actually had that close communion with God, like it was almost in the Garden of Eden, that time of innocence, when Adam and Eve walked with God, and it was so close to that relationship being restored, at least individual with Enoch, that God took him away, translated him. Pretty remarkable. I don't know of anybody else that got that close. But anyway, verse 6. But without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is. That's the beginning. You got to believe that first 5 words of the Bible. Believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So it's impossible to please him without faith. It's a prerequisite, and that is crystal clear here. All of his grace, his mercy, his wisdom, understanding that he can gift to anyone he chooses. It's all out of the reach of man until that speck of faith in him as God gives us new life. And then we can draw near. Light can now enter. My dad used to say, that light travels fast until it enters the human mind. It's like we build our own little black hole in our minds for all the light to be sucked out of it by our rejection in him, by our lack of faith. Well, that's so we see Enoch, and then the great verse 6, great truth there. So now another by faith in verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So now we move forward to Noah was born in 2948 BC. The flood was about some 600 years later, to 2348 BC. He lived 950 years, Noah did, 350 of them after the flood. But anyway, what a perfect example of verse 6 we see in verse 7. Noah lived his life with a knowledge of God, and he was in communication with God. He had a relationship with God. He was humble. We know a few sparse details about Noah. He was like a city king of sorts, a prominent man. And we got to remember also that rain and flooding was not something that they were familiar with. It did not rain prior to the flood. And instead, every night, there was a heavy dew on the ground. And it was like getting a half inch of rain every night. And so the world was well watered before the flood. Make no mistake. But that dew that came down. But anyway, he was a city king of sorts, and he goes about. He gets this warning from God: "Hey, I'm going to destroy all this, and it's going to be a massive flood, and the only way is to build this ship." And he tells him how to build it and everything. And he goes about doing this. Can you imagine how much he was mocked for that? It hadn't rained. God didn't send down rain before. And so they weren't familiar with flooding and the power that comes from the sky like this. But we also know he was a preacher sort, and he was always calling for people to acknowledge God and return to him in their worship. And it was like he was wasting his breath. It was a wicked generation. And like I said, God revealed that this flood was coming, and he gave him instructions. And Noah spent, some estimate, 120 years building that ark. 120 years, all the while being ridiculed for it. But his faith was so strong, and that revelation that God gave him was so clear in his mind, that light that he received was so clear that he was not deterred at all. And it didn't fade from his thoughts, and it didn't shake his faith. And so we see here what it says: condemn the world by doing that. He was, look, we have a faithful man, and it was that contrast between him and everybody else. Then the rest of the world destroyed. Now the next one, move forward even more. Faithful Abraham. Abraham was born in 2000 BC, so that's 4,020 years ago or 22 years ago. And then we see here in verse 8, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called. So that was about 1921 BC. So he was 60 or 70 or whatever. And he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. Didn't know where it was, just go. And he went out, not knowing even where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So just remember the setting. Abraham lived in Mesopotamia. I don't know if everybody can see this or not, but way over in this area. And God told him to leave there. And he ends up coming to the land of Canaan here. And Mesopotamia was idolatry in every household, including Abraham's fathers. Terah. And we see that in Genesis 12. And so Noah lived 350 years. He died only 2 years before Abraham was born. So Noah was still around. This is got so corrupt already. All these people in these cities had arisen already, all the way, all in this entire region, cities have come back from zero now, no people, in 350 years. Does that surprise you? Does that sound remarkable? It's not. It's really not. You do realize that only about 400 years ago that the entire U.S. was a wilderness. And then fly around and take a look around here, and that's only 400 years ago. Chicago was nothing but a swamp 150 years ago. Good one. All right. But yeah, so right. 150 years, so 350 years, yeah. There were civilizations all over the place, and they were, yes, already corrupt and already forgetting God. So Abraham he was called Abram at the time, and he was instructed by God to leave everything he knew, his family, his homeland, all his relatives, and go to a land that God would show him. And just like Noah, his simple faith drove him to obey God's instructions. And again, just like Noah, what was being instructed was counterintuitive. I mean, no, it's like build a big, massive ship for what? Yeah, and it hadn't even rained, and now this Abraham is. This was being around your community and your family was your safety, your power, your structure. It was your livelihood in a lot of cases, and it was your very happiness. He says, leave it. And what did Abram do? He went out, not knowing where he was going, just guided by faith and ultimate trust. Oh, that we could do that for God. He hasn't changed. So it says, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. And as he looks around, this was the land that God showed him to go to, and all he sees is Canaan with these corrupt Canaanite cities, walled cities, and he's living in a tent. And Isaac and Jacob with him, heirs with him of the same promise. These are all buried in the only parcel that Abraham ever owned in the secular sense, in that the land that he inherited. The only one that he bought it. We see this in Genesis 23, 1 through 17, where it talks about Sarah's death. And I'll just read it to you. Sarah lived 127 years, and these are the years of the life of Sarah. 127 years. So keep in mind, now we're talking about Noah living 950 pre-flood, 350 years, 350 of those after it. But then right after that, how fast the longevity of man drops off. She only lives 127 years. And so Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth. These are the Canaanites. And he says, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, hear us, my Lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and he spoke to them, saying, if it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and meet with Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is in the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price as the property for a burial place among you. And so they went back and forth, and he says, no, my Lord, I'll give it to you. And Abram says, no, I'll buy it. And anyway, to make a long story short, that is the only land. And so it says in verse 17, it says, so the field of Ephron, which is in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees which are in the field, which were within all the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went out of the city. So that was the only deeded piece of land he has, and him and all his sons and his wife and are in there, and his sons' wives also, several of them. So anyway, it says in our verse back in our text here, he waited for a city which has foundations, unlike a tent, unlike being a foreigner. He's waiting for a city that God is the builder of, and where there's no corruption. And, so Abraham, I guess the point here is Abraham, God revealed to him a greater truth, that there's something better than this temporary. In John 8:56, Jesus says this. This is very interesting. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Well, of course, Jesus was there when he revealed it to Abraham. Way back before Jesus was born, incarnated, the pre-incarnate Christ was there to convey this to Abraham. And he says, Abraham rejoiced to see it and rejoiced to see my day. He gave him a forecast of what was going to happen. And he saw it and was glad. Anyway, back to verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. That's pretty powerful. In Genesis 17, we see that God changes the name Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. And he plainly states at that time that Sarah will conceive and bear Isaac. And Sarah eventually concluded in her heart that he wasn't just joking. I mean, he really meant that she was gonna conceive. And she was well past her age, childbearing age, and she knew it. But it says here in verse 11, by faith Sarah received strength to conceive seed, because she judged him faithful who had promised. So we know that she did conclude in her heart that he would do what he said. We keep looking back to this chapter, verse 23 of this chapter, of chapter 10, our previous chapter, in verse 23, where it says, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And that's what Sarah said. He who promised is faithful, just like it says here in verse 11 of our text here. So why did Sarah receive strength to conceive, as it says there in verse 11? You want to unlock that power of faith? We can say it out loud together. He who promised is faithful. Verse 12. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, talking about Abraham, he was over 100 at this time. It says him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So Sarah was about 90 and Abraham was 100. And at first they laughed in their unbelief. But then they realized God's not joking. He said it. And he said it again. In Genesis 21:6, it says, and Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. That's after she conceived. She said that. God has made me laugh with joy because of her faith. Verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. Just as we mentioned, Abraham didn't really, the only thing he owned was a burial plot in all the land that he was told was his. But having seen them afar off, were assured of them, just like we saw, embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's us. Strangers, stranger than strange, stranger things. Are we Christians and pilgrims on this earth? And we should each die believing just like they did. Even though we're not seeing the fulfillment in our lifetime of what he's promised, we sure will see it. He will deliver. He who is promised is faithful. Verse 13, in the Amplified, now I'm going to read this. These people all died, controlled and sustained by their faith. but not having received the tangible fulfillment of God's promises, only having seen it and greeted it from a great distance by faith, and all the while acknowledging and confessing that they were strangers and temporary residents and exiles while on earth. So, temporary residents and exiles while on earth. That's any true believer of God's word realize we're only strangers here, and the world is no friend to us, but our Lord Jesus is. Psalm 39:12 says this: "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner, as all my fathers were." And that's where we are. I think we're going to have to stop right there. It'd be nice to have an hour and a half to do this whole chapter and with continuity, but because it's way more effective that way. But we're going to stop right here at verse 14. Brother Cam?